Afternoon, everyone. Thanks for all coming along. I'm here with Eddie here, Eddie Welsh, and Andy Maher's also joining us as well as to present this one. Just got to unmute him. There you go, Andy. You can say hello.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. I'm Andy.
So essentially today, thanks for coming along. We're going to have a bit of a discussion. This is a presentation that Andy was supposed to do at NTech Roadshow and did a couple of rounds of it. Never really got the chance to do it at the rest of the tours that got cancelled. So we thought we'd put it on today. We've extended it a little bit to put a bit more technical stuff in there and just make it a bit of a discussion about additive and subtractive color mixing, because it's something that comes up for us a lot in the market, and also just I think just some general technical stuff about how the LEDs especially work, and I guess about some application examples for that. So just in terms of some housekeeping with the system that we're running on today, so if you do want to ask a question, feel free. There is a attendees, you'll see that there's a question icon that you can I think it says put your hand up or something similar to those words. Feel free to do that. We'll see a question icon or a hand up icon on our screen, which allows me to unmute you to ask a question. You'll see there's also a text question box if you'd like to ask those questions as well, which I can see as we're running along. So I'll see those pop up and we'll answer them when we have a chance. So I'm gonna leave it to Andy to kick off for the start of this. I've got control over the slides, and Andy's. We're all remote at the moment, as you might have well imagine. So I think Andy, if you kick me to the next image, I can kick across as we go through. So I'll roll it over to Andy.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name's Andy Maher. Looking through the attendees list, I've actually met heaps of the people who are attending today. Thanks for making time to see us or to check in with us online today. I understand it's a very unusual period we're living through. As Eddie said before, this presentation was one that we've adapted from one I was doing at NTech. It's not a sales presentation. We're not here to shill product to you. It's a presentation around what we've gleaned from selling multiple generations of LED product into the Australian market over about the last 10-year period. However, we will use our own product as the product examples throughout the presentation. You'll have to forgive us on that. Jands actually came to LED later in the game than many distributors, mostly because we have a really strong theatre background. And until there was a certain point, I'm thinking maybe just on about 9-10 years ago, where the product was actually finally suitable for lighting people and things, as opposed to lighting discos and the like. We actually got to a point where we could use LEDs to light people. And so we thought we'd sort of share a few thoughts around that. There's a lot of product out there, as you're all no doubt aware. Static fixtures, moving lights. There's gear to be used on the stage. There's gear to be used for the auditorium, house lighting, and there's gear for architectural usages. Sometimes we want to create color with LED. Sometimes we need white light with a lot of punch. Sometimes we need them to do both. Many times we need them to dim correctly. In fact, just about all the time, in my opinion. And of course, there's two main approaches to creating color that we're going to go through. There's also a lot of marketing spin around this sort of product. And so we're trying to sort of cut through that a little bit and sort of get to what approach might work best for the kind of work you do. I'm sort of giving away the ending here. It really gets down to application and the kind of work you do, but we'll get to that. Eddie, can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, look, I'm not going to labour any of this stuff. This is all the kind of stuff we know. We'll just do a really quick look at where we've come from. Subtractive colour mixing. I've chosen a quite lovely, I thought, vintage steel Altman par can for those playing at home, and some leaf filters. So obviously we're taking a white light source, we're putting a filter in front of it. really familiar color creation method. Of course, in some static fixtures, we use CMY filters, and also some earlier big outdoor fixtures. And we've got like a little, if you want to do the next animation just there, Eddie, a quick little look at how we use subtractive filters to create color. So that's really obvious. On to the next one, please, Eddie. I tried to think of, as far as additive color mixing goes, I was racking my brain at first for if there were any older fixtures which really were a self-contained additive color mixing unit. And I'd be interested if anyone can name any. I mean, mostly what I was thinking of was things like cyc lights and that sort of thing. So where we would often end up with color mixing was where we had multiple sources. And I tried to think of what show I could find which would have the most park hands I could think of. And my mind instantly went to the early 1980s and Iron Maiden. A huge amount of obviously additive color mixing going on there as that light hits the stage. There's a good little image that can come up here next, Eddie, as well. That'll give us a sort of a real world indication of what happens when we mix those multiple sources. But if anyone towards the end of this has any ideas on any fixtures which were an all-in-one additive color mixing system from this era, that'd be interesting to know. But we'll go on to the next one. Yeah, look, but really, let's cut to the chase. What we're talking about today is LED fixtures. As I mentioned before, LED is finally a mature technology, and we've been through many iterations. In the case of, for example, ETC that we distribute, I think we're into our, it depends how you measure it, but about our 4th generation of ETC LED. We're into about our 4th or 5th generation of chroma Q LEDs. In the early days of LED marketing, and I was guilty of this when I worked for a previous distributor, we talk about things like 16 million colors and 100,000 hours of lamp life and all this kind of early marketing hype that LED was sold around. I think people are sort of seeing through all that now and realizing a lot of that was pretty inaccurate. Again, we're talking about static, moving lights, and architectural. And really, we're sort of going to get into today the process of creating LEDs, colored emitters versus white emitters and how they work. If we go on to the next slide, Eddie, we'll look at additive color mixing. So in theory, of course, I suppose in a perfect world, RGB would cover it. Again, the only saturated colors that RGB can produce are just that. They're red, green, and blue. If you want a saturated amber or a deep purple, sorry, you can't achieve that. So what we're interested in is the achievable color range beyond the marketing hype. Again, though, that's really old news these days. There are very few RGB only fixtures in the market anymore. What the next iteration from all that stuff was, of course, red, green, blue, white, red, green, blue, white, amber, and all that kind of stuff. Simple fact is that the more colors in the array, the more spectrum you can achieve. And yeah, we'll go on to that next one. Thank you, Eddie. This is a good little graphic to give you an idea of a conventional RGB fixture against which is on the left-hand side of the screen there, versus on the right-hand side of the screen, that is an X7 color system. That's actually a 1st generation Vivid system from ETC's cellar door range from a few years ago. So you can see that the achievable color gamut is far, far larger in that 7 color system than in the RGB system. And even just adding a white or an amber LED to that RGB system isn't going to really convincingly add a lot of other options to you. What's actually happened since that X7 system on the right's been introduced is that they've brought in the Source 4 LED 2 system, which uses a lime emitter that Eddie's just Eddie can bring up there. It's actually closer to a lemon lime, and you can see that that really helps us get closer to that ideal tungsten output. Although it's never going to be 100% of tungsten just at this point in history, but we're getting very, very close to emulating that that tungsten output. I might pass over to you, Eddie, for a discussion of CRI.
So when we look at LED and we talk about LED scenarios, so I'll just make sure that we've got the right image come up. So when we look at, people talk about LED and they talk about color rendering. One of the big things that we hear discussed a lot is CRI, stands for color rendering index. Essentially, CRI is a pre-LED measuring tool, originally developed for fluorescent fixtures. And what it's meant to measure is it's meant to measure the theoretical ability for a fixture to render color. Now, it's done via algorithms. I'm going to say it like that today. Essentially, what it allows people to do is put a quantifiable number against the fixture's ability to measure, to replicate color. The big problem with LED sources is that was never meant to measure LED sources. So we see this number on a lot of spec sheets, and it really isn't a perfect measure. It's worse with sources of high or low color temperatures, especially, and it is especially misleading with additive sources. So to give you a bit of an example, on the left-hand side, you can see some high and low color temperature fixtures like low pressure sodium lamps going into some of the metal halide lamps and fluorescents. So really low color temperature fixtures, if you look at the right-hand diagram where it says low pressure sodium lamp, you're looking at these diagrams are available. This is, if you've ever read any of Mike Wood's stuff, this comes from his discussions on CRI, and a few of this stuff I've borrowed from Mike Wood, so I've got to give him some credit, give him credit rights on these diagrams. So the low pressure sodium lamp, essentially on the bottom right hand corner, gives you very terrible color rendering of those swatches. So essentially, CRI is measured by the way a light produces the result against the reference. So the reference being those colors that you see, those 8 colors you see across the top there, and then sorry, 7 colors. Oh, 8, no, my maths is wrong today. And then also down the bottom you see an incandescent fixture, which is a perfect scenario, and then a low pressure sodium lamp, which is kind of the exact opposite of that. So why doesn't it work with LED fixtures? The big reason is because LED fixtures, especially when you look at the RGBs, there's huge gaps in parts of those spectrums, but an LED fixture can still perform well in certain colors. And because the CRI is an average number, the LED fixture can still have a higher CRI, even though it misses specific color ranges. So you've got to be like, kind of take the CRI number, especially with additive sources, as a grain of salt, because essentially it gives you a kind of false, misleading reference, especially when you look at colored fixtures that haven't got a high number of additive colors in the array. So it's something to really think about in the way that those LED fixtures are measured against each other. So the other number we look at in LED, and this doesn't relate so much to additive subtracting, it relates to my next point, which when we talk about color efficiency and the way how efficient a fixture is at producing color. And this talks me into additive subtracting, but in order to get that, we need to have a little chat about efficacy. Essentially, efficacy is a number that we see quoted on a lot of spec sheets, and it's a number that's important in weighing up how efficient an LED fixture is, because it relates power consumption to output. So essentially, the efficacy of an LED, of a luminaire, is its lumens output, so how much light does it output, divided by its power, and essentially you get a lumen per watt. So you end up with a lumen per watt rating that you can put against fixtures. And the kind of caveat to that is it's kind of useless to have an LED fixture that's pumping out 6,000 lumens output, but drawing 600 watts of power to do it. If you're talking about an efficiency scenario, when you go to 600 watts of power for 600 lumens, you're looking at very low lumens per watt, which means that you essentially can do that with a tungsten fixture. So a 750 watt source 4 would be much more efficient than this, because it's essentially pumping out over 9,000 lumens, over 18,000 lumens worth of output. So essentially, you look at that sort of number and you take it with a bit of a grain of salt when you look at it against when LEDs are sitting there saying that they have really high lumen output, but they are drawing heaps of power to do it. And that's when we look at more into the white source LEDs, because they need to have a really high white source to get through the subtractive mixing. So we get into that luminaire efficacy number in order to produce the color. But when we look at efficiency and efficacy, how bright is it in blue is essentially a comment that we hear a lot. And again, this is all, if you want further information on any of this, I'd recommend looking at all of Mike Wood's articles, which will go through all of this in more detail. But essentially we've heard, don't look at the output in white, but how bright is it in blue? How much brighter though is that LED in blue than a standard tungsten lamp or a subtractive mixing white LED source? So we could put both of them. And how do we measure and compare this to tungsten lamps? Taking into account power usage and essentially the output in that color. Essentially, this is color efficiency. It's in development as a standard. It probably won't be ratified as a standard, but more what it gives you is a number. You can work this out yourself as well. Essentially, luminaire efficacy producing colored light versus the same luminaire producing white light at a specific color temperature. So to put that into a diagram, what you've ended up with if you've got two white fixtures, figure 4 and figure 5, one of them is so two fixtures doing white. Sorry, one of them is an LED luminaire on the right. The left-hand side is an incandescent luminaire in color. When that luminaire is producing blue, so in the bottom section, if it's producing a dark blue, say that's 2000 lumens output. On the left-hand side, your incandescent luminaire with the subtractive color, you're still driving 575 watts into that fixture to get out 2000 lumens. So you're still driving that fixture at full in order to get the full output. This again is the same in a white sourced LED fixture, because what you're doing is you're driving the LED full pelt, you're then subtracting with a CMY flag in front of it, and you're driving the color output at the end. So you're essentially, your efficacy or your color efficiency is not as good when you're driving that color. So again, when you look at the right hand in the LED with additive color, if you're doing a dark blue, you'd be only driving 300. We might even be only driving, well, you would only be driving 300 watts in there to get the same 2000 lumens output. So essentially your color efficiency number is much better in the LED side. So you look at that sort of number, and essentially you're looking at 6.7 lumens per watt versus 13.9 in the right example, and 3.5 versus 13.9. So it gives us color efficiencies of 25% and 48%. This is just a way of kind of quantifying that concept of how bright is it in a certain color. And it gives you a measure of being able to measure that in the real world. Okay, so essentially you'd take a measurement across multiple colors, and then you'd average it to get a sample. But it gives you an idea of that concept, of quantified measurement of that concept of color efficiency and how that works. When we talk about subtractive mixing, we did a little example of additive and how that works in a source, but getting back to the bare bones of subtractive mixing. So what essentially is it? It's when a filter blocks the transmission of a certain type of wavelength. So a certain wavelength of light and lets other wavelengths of light through. So that filter has a concept of absorption, which essentially absorbs the visible light output plus some of the UV, depending on the color wavelength of that filter, and it will let the certain wavelengths through. So that filter could be red, it could be magenta, it could be blue, whatever variant of that it is, and whatever part of the spectrum that it is transmitting, and whatever part of the spectrum it's absorbing. They let the wavelengths of their own color pass, and to the greater extent, essentially in a lot of these darker colors like dark reds, dark blues, transmission can be as low as 3%, depending on how much you're getting. So essentially you're blocking 97% of the light that comes out is being blocked by the transmission, and then you're letting 3% of the light through, which is why you have to push more power into the back of it to get more light out at the end. So essentially, when we talk about subtractive mixing in LEDs, we talk about a white sourced LED. So we need to have a white source which has the spectrum in it in order to subtract the spectrum from it, if you get where I'm going. So a white source LED is essentially, this is what a white source chip looks like. So essentially that yellow film across that is actually a phosphor film with LEDs behind it. So the way it works is that you essentially have a blue LED behind. You have a little reflective kind of mixing chamber that sits in behind. In most LEDs, some of them don't have this. Some of them are just a chip on, which essentially just has the chipset right behind the phosphor. But essentially what you've got here is you've got a blue LED which shines through a remote phosphor element, producing white light. So the white source is a blue chip with that phosphor coating. At times, sometimes this has other spectrum added in order to fill up the color spectrum, so different variances of the blue underneath, plus different variants of the phosphor, depending on what you've got. So you may have seen fade to warm LEDs, which essentially have a tiger stripe through the top of them. Those LEDs essentially allow you to get that fade to warm, so it warms up that spectrum, so it actually has a warmer phosphor element. So differing the color of the phosphor will essentially differ the output of the white LED, the correlated color temperature of that white LED. So it's actually a fairly simple design when you look at it, but obviously it's been refined over years using different LEDs in the back end and different phosphor elements that will go. It's been refined actually by the architectural market. So we in the theatrical market have not driven this. It's come out of architectural. Architectural is where that technology's come from. That's where the economies of scale are. That's where we've got the leverage. That's where essentially all of the R&D money comes from, and it gets shoehorned into lighting fixtures. There are certain manufacturers making LED chipset, white LED chips around the world. There are really only a couple of manufacturers that make for most of the products out there in terms of a white LED source. Most of these white LED sources actually go into high output moving lights, and that's where they sit. So the problem with a white source is that a white LED really isn't full spectrum. So essentially, if you're looking at the wavelength of an incandescent fixture, you can see here essentially this is where we sit with the wavelength of an incandescent fixture in the color spectrum, and it's kind of filled out the colors for you to make it easy to read, but that's where you are on the wavelength. Now, essentially, this is the typical white LED spectral map. So as you can see, there's a quite significant blue spike in that LED. So you'll probably see here that there is around this area here, there's quite a significant blue spike. Now that significant blue spike means that you actually get quite well rendered blues and greens when you actually go into a CMY mixing source. So you'll sometimes find that when you push up a moving light, especially if you're doing an AB of a white sourced LED moving light, you probably find that the blues in some of those LED fixtures will be super bright compared to even an additive source blue in some instances, because that spectral map, that spectral spike in the blue spike that LEDs have, allow it to have a lot more spectrum in that blue space. So the blues will actually shine brighter sometimes than some of the other colors in that spectrum. Now, where you see the dips, as you see dips, and this is not every LED, this is a typical kind of cool white LED that you're looking at here. Differing color temperatures of LED have differing spectral spikes. Most all of them, though, have a blue spike. Now, what you actually can see as well, what you'll see is that you actually get some fixtures when you're in the warmer spectrum that'll put in a bit more of a spike into this place so that they end up doing more of that coming through. So they'll end up trying to push more warm white in and pull this blue spike down a bit. It doesn't ever go down that low. What this section of an LED actually is that this part here is the blue. So that is the blue behind the phosphor, and most of this part here actually comes from the phosphor glowing itself. So that color temperature comes from the blue behind, and this section over here comes from the phosphor. Now it just gives you an idea of how that system actually, how white LEDs. Now what I'm trying to get to here is that really white LEDs, if you're using a theatrical color scenario where you want really bright, vivid, spectrally sensitive color, a white LED with a filter is probably not your best scenario because you're missing a lot of this stuff that's sitting in blue spectral LEDs. Now, and you have these blue spikes that you don't have in the tungsten fixtures. So still a additive mixing source is still probably the best scenario for a colored specific show. So something that really relies on spectrally mapped color, because we can actually tailor that additive source to the color map that we need in a theatrical space, which is what the manufacturers do. Now, secondly, the reason why we would use a white source is Andy's going to go through in a second, but you can see that you'll get really high output white light that you can use in high output white applications. So I'll move on for Andy to run through the next section.
Yeah, so we've just established that additive equals awesome. So why would we bother with a white source? There's a couple of reasons why, and I've again chosen a couple of our products to illustrate. But I think the concept is probably pretty sound. On the left-hand side here, you've got that's essentially an LED retrofit for a source 4. So it basically slides into the back. You can see it's got a white source that's around about the same size as an HPL lamp. It fits into the source 4 reflector axially, just like your HPL lamp would, and gives you nigh on 700, very similar output to the 750 HPL, in fact slightly brighter in some circumstances. And on the right-hand side, you've got the Roby Esprit, which uses a high output white light source as well in a moving fixture. Why would you bother? Well, in the case of the source forward, which is the LED retrofit kit, getting a multi-spectral source into the size required to work in that reflector would have been very, very challenging. And so they've gone with a white light specialist product. And it's the kind, it gets down to the application again. A lot of the time, source 4s and theatre profiles are doing white light to light actors. They also might be doing gallery or museum work or theme park work or that sort of thing. So having a white source is if it's doing white light majority of the time, is okay. In the case of the Esprit, that's intended for very high output use on a stage, let's say a rock and roll stage. And often what we need at the moment is a lot of punch to compete with those high output LED screens that are being used in stadiums. So hence in white, your Roby Esprit is going to have enough punch to cut through that on-stage brightness. Another reason you might want to look at a white source is what Eddie mentioned before. If you want to go for a fade to warm fixture, often, I mean, the classic example there is in the LED auditorium house light. So we want to change our auditorium to LED. The house lighting just needs to be white, but we want to emulate that beautiful tungsten feel as the filament gets cooler, it gets redder. So we'd have a fade to warm white source would be another reason why you might go with a white sourced fixture if it doesn't need to do color, I suppose is the answer to that one. Do you want to go on to the next one, Eddie? So just tell me which one is better. Look, the answer here is it depends. I think we've sort of built that case over the course of this. Use your tungsten lamps for filter use. So going right back to the example of Iron Maiden from 1982. For the best LED color, use a true multi-spectral additive colored array. And for highly efficient bright white light, use a tungsten or daylight emulating LED array with subtractive mixing. What we would encourage you to do is go past any marketing that tells you that one method is better than the other. The reality is you need to choose one that that best suits the kind of performances and the kind of events that you're lighting or will be lighting very soon, I hope. And I mean, I suppose the other thing that I like to throw in at this point is I made a lot of mistakes when I was first demonstrating our LED product to people. I'd go into, let's say, a venue and find a white cyc and just focus the fixture on that cyc. I'd highly encourage you to, when you're assessing LED fixtures, to light people and things with them. Look at the way they reproduce color. Look at them in your venue. And the other thing that I think is a really good thing to do is set the fixtures up, put them into your preferred color if you're assessing that. Then go off and have lunch. Come back after an hour or two and just see how well they've held that color, how well the fixture is designed to deal with thermal droop and all that sort of stuff that can become an issue over a long production day. I think I'll throw it to you now, Eddie.
So the I mean, so this is just a scenario that this is something that I always say is that always choose the technology that's right for the application. Don't let the technology dictate the application. Essentially what I'm just saying there is like, think about the application that you're trying to achieve. What are you trying to do? What's the scenario? What are we trying to, don't let just because there's a technology out there that is essentially being given to you or says that it's the best new technology, make sure that you're actually deciding on the technology that suits what you're trying to do. If you're trying to front light people, maybe you should look at an additive source that has more spectrum that allows you to do a better job of front lighting people. So everyone probably has seen a lot of white sourced LEDs in the past, some older technology ones that actually don't render color that well because they're not a full spectral white LED. Now the better ones, and looking forward into the future, actually do that a lot better. So you've got to essentially look at the right technology for the application, and again, don't let the technology dictate the application. Now, when we look forward into a bit of a comparison, now this is using some of our product obviously as a comparison, but if you look at an Esprit, which is a white light LED source, you'd be looking at places like production rentals, so high output touring products, so more effects and more high output. So the more you put in front of that light source, the brighter you need that light source to be. So as you start putting in prisms, as you start putting in gobos, as you start putting in stuff like that, you need a brighter LED source behind it. So you're probably not looking at really mimicking Lee 119 or getting yourself a perfect 136. You know, you're looking at this high output white flash, for want of a better term, flash and trash sort of stuff. Now, when you look at large venue stuff as well, you're looking at high output as well. So all these kind of, as you see, there's a term that comes through, this is super high output. So white LED sources suit really high output applications. When you look at a comparison of a different moving light, and we look at theaters, TV studios, and again, AV rental is another space that could be used. But essentially these two applications for a theater, TV studio, where you've got really high, you need high color spectrum, you need very good color rendering, you need all of those things that come out of it because you have a multispectral source. And heading back to that diagram that I showed you before of the LED spectrum, you can see that there are gaps in those spectrums, which means spectral distribution, which means you will actually have gaps in a white LED source when you put that white LED source onto a subject. So an additive source seeks to fix that in that kind of really highly refined color space, which is what you see when you look at highly designed and good quality additive sources. Yeah, and definitely there's really a lot of other things that you want to consider when you're choosing an LED source. Andy spoke about thermal droop for a little bit. We talk about power usage, so how much power is that fixture using in that application. And again, we go back to that color efficiency slide where we look at how much power we're sticking up a fixture to get it to do that, that same color efficiency. Now, when you look at power usage, you've also got to think about in terms of latent power draw, which is how much output is that fixture taking when it's off. So how much power supply is drawing power, all those sorts of things contribute to the power usage of a fixture. Now, we're saving a lot of power in an additive source usually as well, because even though we might be doing a really dark blue, we're actually only using maybe 1/10 of the emitters in the fixture to produce that blue. So 180 watt fixture might actually only be using 18 watts to produce your darker colors. So you look at that, whereas a white LED source might be using a lot more power to do that. Now, again, there's not saying that the white LED source is any worse because of that. It just depends on it depends on what your scenario is. If you're looking at a sustainability argument or you're looking at dropping your power usage, that may contribute to your conversation. And also, you really got to look at hybrid systems as well. There's still a place for efficient tungsten and efficient discharge lamps. So when you get into the higher output beam light fixtures, so you're looking at fixtures with that really tight beam source, you really can't do that in LED. You can't. LEDs are a flat source. So as you saw from that picture before, LEDs are essentially a flat plane. So in order to reflect a whole bunch of light and shoot it out into a high output beam, we really can't do that in LED sources. We can't get that really tight peaked beam. Noise is definitely a big thing to think about. And then again, always look at the warranty periods and support on fixtures, because that's going to essentially sit you in a position of how long is this fixture expected to give me as it goes through. And again, speaking of aging of LEDs, and this is something that we didn't talk about as much as we went through the presentation, but in terms of the way an LED ages, white sources for subtractive mixing white sources will also age. Don't just think that all like LED color, we've seen kind of the cheaper end fixtures, the less well-designed fixtures, it's essentially drop their green output over time, or they might drop their red output. So you see this kind of weird color matching across fixtures. Now that degradation happens actually quicker in white source fixtures, because what degrades is the phosphor film. So essentially the phosphor film will degrade and fall that back. Now, because that degradation happens quicker, and you get quicker to that what we call L70, which is the rating of 70% of the lifespan of 70% of the output of the LEDs, which is what that 20,000 hours or 50,000 hours rating gets you to. Now that L70 rating, the white sources will actually get there quicker, because you're usually driving the LEDs harder for longer periods. So when you look at a color mixing source, you're actually driving each of the LEDs individually over certain periods, and you can actually have some really issues over time with a white source fixture because of that. Without being too product heavy, Roby have a interchangeable engine that allows you to now, in that Esprit product, that allows you to transfer the engine across fixtures. So, I mean, there are solutions to some of these problems as well in that white source product. Andy, did you have anything to add at the end there?
Oh, look, I just wanted to, to speak to this last image. That's actually the Alexander Theatre at, is it the Alexander Theatre? Well, it's at Monash University. And that's actually an RGBW house lighting project that we did about 12 months ago now. So effectively in this state, looks like a pretty convincing tungsten emulation, I would have thought, but you can do some great theming of that space too. I suppose a lot over the last sort of couple of years, Eddie and I have not just been stage lighting guys, we've also been auditorium house lighting, very focused on that sort of thing, and we'll find that the big decision when it comes to doing auditorium lighting is whether you go for white light or an additive mixing system. And there's benefits to be gained by both, I suppose. But I just thought I'd mention what that last image is.
Cool. I guess I'll throw it open to some questions if anyone has any. This is kind of a very short conversation about a very technical topic, really, just to give an idea of the kind of the discussion pieces that we usually get around these subjects. But if anyone has any questions, feel free to either send them through on like hit that raise hand button, or send through a text question. I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that if you wanted to ask any questions. While everyone's thinking up questions that they might want to ask, what we're actually going to do as well is every 2 p.m. every Thursday, we're going to be running webinars. That will change topics. Obviously, we won't run this one again. What we'll be running next week is I'll be running a networking for lighting 101 session. So essentially going through the network systems for our kind of modern lighting control systems, where we sit in how to network them together, what IP addresses are, what subnets are, all those sorts of things that some people consider as black magic sitting under the hood of a network device. We'll try and demystify some of those terms for you and have a discussion about what networking is and what it means for our industry. And it doesn't necessarily mean what the IT guy in your theatre, school, performing arts centre, production company thinks it is. So we can use networking within our scenarios for a very different purpose. Now, don't see any questions coming through. So if anyone does have any questions that they think of going through as they go away from here, let me know, let Andy or I know. Any feedback that you would like. Simon's asked a question. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, Simon said I had a discussion there about the differences, the way LEDs and especially fixtures themselves look into the eye or to the camera. That's a really big topic to answer in this period. But essentially, you will obviously see a difference between the way a human eye renders the color of a fixture versus the way that the aperture of a camera will. Interestingly, on that topic, if you want a bit more information about studio lighting and the way cameras will work with LEDs, is that the ETC have a thing called Study Hall that they've just started through this period. And Study Hall, the first webinar was actually about studio lighting and how studios will be lit and how LED references in with cameras. So it's a discussion that just discussion in what we can use for that. So cool. So a couple of questions. Just okay. One question was, where do you see the future of LED headed? That's a really interesting question. We kind of hit a plateau point, I think, personally, and I've spoken to a lot of people that we've talked about where we sit with LED. We're hitting that top point of efficiency of LEDs at the moment, about how much power we put in versus how much light we can get out. So we're actually hitting that plateau. So the efficiency, we probably won't see the efficiency gains that we've seen, say, over the last 5 or 10 years. In the last kind of 5 or 10 years, we won't see that coming into the next 5 or 10. So we won't see those exponential gains in efficiency, which means that it'll kind of those super high output sources will essentially have to put more LEDs into them, if you know what I mean. So we'll probably only see efficiency gains maybe 10, 15%, maybe over the next 5 years, depending on the new technology. The biggest technology I think that will change the industry again is probably laser technology. There are some examples of laser fixtures in the market at the moment. They're very primitive at the moment and very expensive for what we need them to do, but they can, they probably have the ability to do a bit more for our industry going forward as LED. It's probably the next technology that we'll use in high output moving lights other than LEDs. You probably notice when you get to a really high output LED source, like a 1000-watt LED source, that fixture goes right up in weight. So you end up with fixtures that sit in the 40, 50 kilo mark because of the amount of cooling that you have to put in the back and how big that LED source is, not necessarily the source itself, but the actual the heat sink and the cooling off the back of the source that in order to cool that LED chip at 1000 watts. Because one of the misnomers for LED is that they don't produce any heat. They actually produce quite a lot of heat for the amount of power that you put into them. And you have to get rid of that heat somewhere, and it doesn't happen out the front of a fixture like in a traditional tungsten fixture. Cool. Question about Mike Wood's content. So it's all available. I think the magazine they have, Protocol is the old magazine it's available in. Mike Wood does articles about plenty of all of these sorts of applications. He's very, very technical. And I borrowed some of his stuff for this presentation just because he explains that really well. So Protocol, I think, is the magazine's name, which is part of the Plaza Group or Esther Group. So that has all the Mike Wood articles. He also does very good breakdown articles about how moving lights work. So essentially, if you've got a new fixture, he'll pull it apart and have a look at it.
Maybe we could send out a few of his articles to give people an idea of some of the other stuff he does.
I could put some. Yeah, definitely. I could put some in an email out to people. A question about the reference source for one of those diagrams. Kind of, does that question mean reference source as in what color temperature or what type of fixture was in that? I don't quite know what I think it's from UCR. So if you wanna, cool. I'll write, so for students just beginning, what or where would you suggest the best source of info for this sort of stuff to start them off? It's an interesting one. I don't know if there's a huge amount of information out there other than what Mike Wood does on these subjects. You can probably find information. Yeah, it depends on what type of information you're after. If it's about additive mixing in general, there's a lot of articles out on, about additive mixing, so that give you that sort of input. We will always keep doing presentations like this about explaining to people what the sources are and how to use individual sources. If anybody else has any input on that, let me know, but I can definitely recommend all of Mike's stuff because that's essentially where a lot of people get that information, just because he's very technical within our industry. You'll find a lot of information around for the architectural space. So you find a lot of information, especially about white LED sources in the architectural space. And info on just how LEDs work as well, which is another question that come in. Info from that can actually be found from a lot of the manufacturers. So Philips have quite good, well, they used to have quite good, I'm not sure these days, but they have quite good discussions on how LED technology works. There is a really good discussion on, really simplified discussion on one of those, can't remember which one it is. If I find the content, I'll email that through as well, which is a How Stuff Works, one of those How Stuff Works channels, which essentially goes through how an LED creates light, which is a very simple, which is a very complex concept explained very simply. So all good. Cool. All right. If there's no more questions there from anybody.
Just one thing I'd add is that if anyone has any requests around topics for these sorts of sessions, where, look, like a lot of people, we're looking to keep people informed and entertained and all that sort of stuff during this period. If there's any specific topics around lighting that you'd like to know more about, we're happy to dig into it. One thing that Eddie didn't mention before is that last week he ran a webinar around the EOS platform, and I suspect we'll probably do some more training around the ETC control systems for specific.
Yeah, there's another Q&A session for EOS on the week after Easter, so the 16th of April. The 9th of April, which is next Thursday, will be our networking session, and then we haven't slated past the 16th yet, but you can expect every Thursday at 2 p.m. there'll be a session. So if you do, as Andy said, if you do have any ideas of sessions that you'd like to run, please email through. Best email address to send it to is marketing@jands.com.au, which is probably the email address that you saw on the registration. So use that email address, that'll get to us. If you have our email addresses, feel free to send emails to those as well. But marketing@Jands is the first one to point a call for all general sort of stuff like that. So probably gives you an idea. But hopefully everyone got something out of today. We tried to make it a little bit technical, a little bit not so word heavy, but to try and get some couple of concepts across. It's a very, as you would have said, it's a topic that has a lot of personal preference in there as well, but also application specific stuff. So cool. All right. Feel free to send through an email to us and let us know what you thought of today. But thanks a lot for coming along, everyone.
Thanks for your time, everyone.